Otto von Bismarck, a name every single one of us heard at some point, and a name many people hold in high regard. Bismarck has gone down in history as one of its great men, maybe not as high up there as Napoleon Bonaparte, Julius Caesar or George Washington, but he is still part of that list, even if a few numbers below. The architect of the empire and German unification, forging the nation, in his own words, by iron and blood, created the first welfare state in the world, and what subsequently followed was a golden age for Germany, both economically and scientifically, and none of that would have been possible without his firm and enlightened guidance. But all of that changed in 1890, when a young and ambitious prince came and sat on the German throne, Kaiser Wilhelm II. In that year, the new Kaiser dismissed the Iron Chancellor from his position of power, which came at horrible costs according to many. The dismissal of Otto von Bismarck is regarded as the first and probably among the worst mistakes the Kaiser could have made. Bismarck was the architect, quite literally, of the new German Golden Age, and the dismissal is seen as proof that the new Kaiser acted unreasonably and in a selfish manner. Everyone is aware that Wilhelm was more eager to involve himself in political matters, unlike the laid-back approach his grandfather Wilhelm I took. He was ambitious and, most importantly, pretty stubborn at times to carve out Germany's place in the world. And yet, despite everyone saying that the dismissal of Bismarck was a great mistake, few people actually take the time to ask the big question: why? Some assumptions get thrown around, that Wilhelm was very stubborn and wanted his own way, ignoring the advice and criticism of the Iron Chancellor, or that the two clash in the realm of foreign policy. While there certainly are a few videos that go a little bit deeper and shed some more nuances on the matter, the consensus among many people still stands that the dismissal was a great mistake. This is one of the topics I did not give attention while making my documentary on Kaiser Wilhelm II almost 2 years ago, but since I have pledged to revisit Old Willie again with more of the knowledge I gathered since then, to revise and shed some more light on the things I talked about. And what better way to start this revision off than with a misunderstood and skewed topic? In this video, I will be exploring the relationship between Kaiser Wilhelm II and Otto von Bismarck and the causes that led to his dismissal. I want to make the case that this was not a reckless and moronic decision as many were led to believe, and that perhaps by 1890 it was time for the Iron Chancellor to take his leave for his own sake. But first, we need to explore the relationship between the two before the coronation of 1888. For the sake of fairness, despite having my own little biases, I will not be using the memoirs either from Bismarck or Wilhelm as sources in this video. Both speak of what happened from their own view and make the case for why they are right. And in the end, it will just turn into another he said she said situation. If I take Wilhelm for his word, then what reason is there to not take Bismarck for his word on what happened? So the memoirs will be left out, and I will be relying on various historians and eyewitnesses from that time instead to make my case. While the Kaiser was still a prince, there really weren't that many interactions between him and the Iron Chancellor. Bismarck was not exactly too interested in the prince and focused more on his career. But despite that, as he was growing up, the prince developed an admiration for the Chancellor and his ways, and sought to perhaps one day be just like him. Later on, when it was established that Wilhelm's father, Frederick III, had throat cancer, it became apparent to Bismarck that he didn't have that long to live, and this meant that the young Wilhelm would ascend the throne much earlier than other people had thought. And since Wilhelm was still young, it all turned into a battle of who could influence him the most. Bismarck's primary rival in this regard was Field Marshal Alfred von Waldersee, who became a close confidant in Wilhelm. And because of that, Bismarck saw Waldersee as a threat to his political authority. Utilizing his political power, he would influence Waldersee's inner circle with bribes, blackmail, and general manipulation. He even tasked his son, Herbert von Bismarck, with monitoring the two closely and gaining some kind of leverage over the prince. It was typical of Bismarck to use such methods to attempt to control the crown prince. He had derogatory articles printed targeting his opponents, ruining their reputations with all kinds of scandals. And this control even extended to Wilhelm's own parents, as he did not want their more liberal ideas influencing the boy. You see, there is something you must know of how Bismarck in general operated in his political career. Bismarck was a control freak in everything he did. He wanted to be involved in all matters from domestic affairs to foreign affairs, and kept everyone around him under his thumb, especially Kaiser Wilhelm I, who throughout his reign mostly just sat back and let Bismarck do all the work for him. He was also, as everyone around him knew, extremely stubborn and always took an uncompromising stance. It was either his way or no one's way at all. Jonathan Steinberg's biography of the Iron Chancellor contains a lot of these instances, but I will quote one incident involving the King of Saxony. He respected nobody and paid no attention even to his royal visitors. On the 20th of April 1880, King Albert of Saxony had an uncomfortable hour with him. When the king uttered a differing opinion, Bismarck changed his expression and the king immediately yielded. It is Bismarck's misfortune, the king declared, that he cannot listen to a contrary opinion and immediately conjectures ulterior motives. Everyone does his will, the Kaiser first of all. This was most apparent when examining the relationship between him and Kaiser Wilhelm I. Since he was the king, and later Kaiser, Wilhelm was Bismarck's superior. He had the right to give him orders, fire him, and so forth. And yet in reality it was completely the other way around. It was Wilhelm who was under Bismarck's thumb, so to say. Anytime he and the Chancellor would disagree on an issue, Bismarck would threaten to resign, and since the Kaiser saw him as irreplaceable, he always yielded to his demands. Historian Christopher Clark, in his book about the history of Prussia, had this to say in regards to their relationship. Bismarck never behaved as if he had a boss. This was most glaringly apparent in his relations with Wilhelm I. As Chancellor, Bismarck frequently pushed policies through against the monarch's will. When the king created obstructions, Bismarck resorted to tantrums and fits of weeping, backed up by the threat, sometimes unspoken and sometimes explicit, to resign and to return to the comfortable peace of his estate. When Bismarck wanted to consolidate his relationship with the monarch, he generally did so not by endearing himself directly to the sovereign, but by engineering crises that highlighted his own indispensability, like a helmsman who steers into the storm in order to demonstrate his mastery of the ship. Wilhelm I himself was even noted to have said once in a conversation, "It is hard to be Kaiser under Bismarck." And his influence over the young Wilhelm II was strategic. He wanted it to be business as usual and make sure that the crown prince would be as willing to let him do things without interruption as his grandfather. Prominent British diplomat Sir Robert Morier, in a letter written to Queen Victoria, would discuss the relationship between the two and what Bismarck had planned with the young boy. The objective of Bismarck has been and is to isolate the crown prince from all persons not immediately under his influence. He knows that the prince is a man of non-optimistic character, and that this isolation acts upon him in a depressing manner, and he believes that he can depress him into submission. Now, I am not necessarily saying all of this to criticize Bismarck's character and make him look like a bad guy. There is nothing inherently wrong about the way he is handling stuff. It is political power 101, and without it, he wouldn't be in the position he was. Rather, this attitude and personality and the way he handled and influenced Wilhelm II sets the stage for the upcoming conflict between the two of them. Wilhelm despised the domineering and controlling attitude of Bismarck, and he did not want to be or be seen as his puppet, and he was not willing to take a submissive role similar to his grandfather. So already taking into account their personalities, this was something destined to happen from the get-go. Bismarck wanted to contain and keep the soon-to-be Kaiser under his thumb, and Wilhelm was not having any of that, and wanted to be independent of the Chancellor's metaphorical chains. The question wasn't whether they were gonna bump heads, the question was when and who was gonna come out on top in the end. Crown Prince Wilhelm was coronated as German Emperor and King of Prussia in June 1888 after his father passed away from throat cancer, and immediately when he got a hold of the ship's steering wheel, he got to work implementing his visions. Wilhelm's primary focus was in the realm of domestic affairs and sought to reform the empire from within and make the empire a stronger economic powerhouse than it already was. But at the same time, he also had to deal with Bismarck, and considering the way Bismarck handled stuff, the two of them clashed many times over domestic issues. Bismarck tried to undermine Wilhelm and his efforts to still retain the complete oversight and control he had. For example, in an effort to improve housing, transport, and industry, Wilhelm gave individual ministers the complete freedom to do as they saw fit without having to seek approval either from him or the chancellor, believing that this would accelerate efforts so they aren't slowed down by bureaucracy. Only to learn sometime later that Bismarck was impeding their works by insisting that every decision they made had to be sanctioned by him, directly going against the freedoms the Kaiser provided them. Or, probably worse, was when Wilhelm was shocked to learn that every letter and report that was addressed to him was intercepted by the Chancellor beforehand, with him sometimes even censoring certain parts of letters and reports, and he would even go as far as to issue out contradictory orders in secret to undermine his authority. As you can probably imagine, the Kaiser was not exactly happy with what Bismarck was doing, and increasingly saw him as an obstacle when it came to his visions. But notice something, and this is very important. Wilhelm and Bismarck weren't clashing over foreign policy issues, but rather domestic issues. As I mentioned in the beginning, many people have the impression that the source of conflict had been foreign policy, but in that regard there was very little disagreement compared to domestic issues. Wilhelm had fully intended to continue Bismarck's foreign policy, with Christopher Clark writing in his biography of the Kaiser, in a speech given before the provincial parliament of Brandenburg on the 8th of February, the text of which was immediately passed to the press. Wilhelm had demonstratively aligned himself with Bismarck's foreign policy. There is one aspect of Bismarck that also needs to be brought up, something I have not really seen anyone talking about, which almost definitely contributed to the troubles he found himself in. When Bismarck was dismissed as Chancellor, he was 75 years old, an old man in every way possible at that time. And due to this old age and a few other factors, Bismarck had suffered deteriorating mental health as the years went by, and this had an impact on his role as Chancellor, especially in regards to domestic affairs. The Bismarck who had just taken power in 1862 seemed like a completely different person compared to the Bismarck in 1888, and it was clear to pretty much everyone in his circle that he wasn't the man he once was. In his final years, Bismarck's rages became increasingly erratic and irrational. In addition, he seemed to be experiencing paranoia and delusions. He began to distrust those around him and believe they were plotting against him. Steinberg documents a few instances in his biography that showed his worsening mental condition, already starting in the mid-1870s. Bismarck's physical and psychological condition deteriorated during 1875. He slept so badly that he often received cabinet ministers and officials in bed. His temper worsened, and the smallest irritation, a servant not placing a chair somewhere quickly enough, would cause an outburst of uncontrolled rage. So you have a man who is very controlling and wants to have a firm hand and oversight over everything, and then his mental health starts deteriorating, making him more irrational, paranoid, and prone to outbursts of uncontrolled rage. This was a ticking time bomb, and then in 1890, Bismarck would attempt his boldest stunt in German politics since the formation of the empire, which would result in the Kaiser dismissing him as Chancellor, the clash over the quote-unquote social question. The social question was one of, if not the most important reform effort spearheaded by Wilhelm during his early years as Kaiser. It primarily concerned workers' rights, and the Kaiser aimed to improve the conditions of the working class. He advocated for things like disability insurance, limited night work, Sunday rest, child protection, and higher wages, just to name a few. The Prussian Minister of Agriculture, Robert von Ballhausen, would hear the Kaiser declaring that a great deal has to be done to prevent capital from consuming labor, since most industrialists exploit workers ruthlessly and ruin them. And his efforts even went a bit to the extreme, like, hold on, let me check my notes here, threatening to raise the villas of rich industrialists if they didn't raise wages. This great sympathy towards the working class actually came from his upbringing. Instead of the usual Prussian aristocratic and militarist upbringing, his tutor would also make sure he engaged in other activities, like for example bringing the crown prince to inspect factories, talk to workers, and even work alongside them for several hours as if he was just another employee. And thanks to this exposure and experience to a lower class lifestyle, he developed a great sympathy towards the workers and pledged to improve their standard of living. So, as you can imagine, the social question was kind of a big deal for Willy, and he was actually following in the footsteps of Bismarck with his efforts, since he had also taken a similar stance in the past. Bismarck believed that by improving the conditions of the workers, he would cripple the support base of the Social Democrats. And that is why under him the German Empire became the first welfare state in the world. But now in the late 1880s, let's just say he had a mild change of opinion in that regard. Another effort by the Kaiser was to abolish the infamous anti-socialist laws introduced by Bismarck to combat social democracy with force, like banning or censoring their publications and outlawing trade unions. And Bismarck was very keen on having these laws extended, as the deadline soon approached. And so he came up with a grand strategy to not only extend the laws, but also strengthen his own power in Germany, which was starting to wane, and make the Kaiser submit to him. You see, there was an ongoing worker strike happening in the Rhineland, with the Kaiser working to tirelessly mediate between the workers and employers. So, what did Bismarck want to do in regards to the strikes? Well, it's the simple act of gunning down striking workers in the streets. So, here is how it worked. Make the strikes escalate and create domestic political chaos by introducing even harsher anti-socialist laws, which would undoubtedly cause more demonstrations and protests from workers, bringing Germany on the brink of civil war, and then ride into the German parliament as the savior and crush the petty socialists once and for all. Not only would the anti-socialist laws be extended, but also made harsher, and at that point the Kaiser would have made himself unpopular, so Bismarck could force his hand and re-solidify his rule. It was simply genius. Christopher Clark would write on this plot by Bismarck as follows. Bismarck seems to have had a range of options in mind. He had long taken the view that harsh repression was the only means by which the state could meet the challenge of the social democratic movement. If the strikes and turbulence were allowed to continue with minimum state intervention, this would weaken Reichstag resistance to the new and more repressive anti-socialist law favored by the chancellor. If this tactic failed, there remained the extreme option of a coup d'etat, with the risk of ensuing civil war. In such difficult and unpredictable circumstances, it was foreseeable that Bismarck would possibly emerge, much as he had during the Prussian constitutional crisis of 1862, as the only person capable of maintaining the ship of state on an even keel. As the German politician and journalist Rudolf Augstein wrote in a Spiegel article in the late 1980s, commenting on a new Bismarck biography that had been published, deliberately, in order to prove himself indispensable, he sought to create domestic political chaos. And when Wilhelm learned of the newly proposed anti-socialist laws by Bismarck, yeah, I don't think you have to imagine that he was not exactly happy. Wilhelm was aware that just the fact that the bill would be introduced and debated on would cause enormous protests to erupt across the country, so he requested Bismarck to tone down a few of the more controversial points of it, and Bismarck refused. And it was then that the Kaiser finally put his foot down, and the newly proposed anti-socialist laws were struck down as they were being introduced to Parliament, and historian Katya would elaborate on what went down in her book on the German Empire. He, Wilhelm, wanted to be loved by his new subjects, and the way to achieve this was not with a bloody massacre of workers. Bismarck had got used to decades of Hohenzollern submission and so did not move an inch, expecting Wilhelm to give in. Instead, this was the opportunity the Reichstag had been waiting for. After years of Bismarckian domination, even former allies like the Central Party politician Peter Reichensperger now sensed that the Junker's time was up and they let his anti-socialist bill collapse. Going behind the Kaiser's back, issuing out contradictory orders, reports, and letters meant for him was one thing. Hatching up a plot to cause a domestic crisis and bring the empire on the brink of civil war so he can march in as the savior was a whole different thing. And that is when the sovereign decided that Bismarck was much more trouble than he was worth. So, the Kaiser approached Bismarck with one more possible compromise. In his eyes, Bismarck could not be allowed to interfere or have a say in domestic affairs anymore, and for that reason, the Kaiser demanded Bismarck's resignation as chancellor. But, still recognizing his skills in foreign affairs, was willing to still have him on as foreign minister. As long as Bismarck kept his hands out of domestic issues and worked his magic in other countries, the Kaiser would be satisfied. But, unsurprisingly, considering the kind of man Bismarck was, for him it was either chancellor or nothing, so he promptly rejected the Kaiser's offer. And at that point, there was no other way. Compromise was attempted, but to no avail. There was only one thing left to do. 2 months later, on the 20th of March 1890, the Kaiser officially dismissed Bismarck from his position as Chancellor of the German Empire. The differences and clashes in domestic politics at last reached a breaking point, and the Kaiser came out on top. On the 22nd of March, Wilhelm would have an audience with the British ambassador to Germany, Sir Edward Mallet, and during that audience the two of them discussed the reasons for the dismissal of Bismarck. And in his official report back to London, this is what the ambassador noted from their conversation, and Wilhelm's thoughts on the whole fiasco a few days ago. Wilhelm spoke about the long history of his differences with the former Reichs-Chancellor regarding the workers' protection issue and the socialist law. He accused Bismarck of deliberately wanting to escalate class conflict to the extreme, with the intention of then sweeping the streets clean using grape-shot ammunition. Quoting Wilhelm directly here, "But for me, a young monarch who had just ascended the throne, and for my entire house, it would have been catastrophic if I had allowed my people to be shot down in the streets without even investigating their grievances. People would have said that I only knew how to rule with bayonets." However, instead of listening to him, Bismarck had secretly tried to undermine his, Wilhelm's, social policy initiative and treated him like a schoolboy. And as for Bismarck, he would live the rest of his life in retirement on his estate in the town of Aumühle. But to say that he was still politically involved would be an understatement. He would continue holding meetings with certain people, give interviews, and, most importantly of all, he operated a giant smear campaign against the Kaiser using newspapers and interviews to his advantage. You know the widely common myth that Wilhelm was mentally unstable? Those come directly from Bismarck's campaign against him. And this campaign didn't just spread rumors and misconceptions, but even went as far as leaking private government documents and treaties, like in 1896 when Bismarck leaked a secret non-aggression reinsurance treaty between Germany and Russia in an effort to damage Wilhelm's reputation abroad. Or, probably his worst stunt, when he almost single-handedly ruined German-Russian relations by falsely telling the Russian ambassador to Germany that he had resigned over Wilhelm's supposedly anti-Russian views and policy. And this caused such an outrage in the foreign ministry that the Kaiser was seeking legal action against him. After hearing that Bismarck had falsely told the Russian ambassador Shuvalov that he had resigned in protest at the Kaiser's anti-Russian policy, Wilhelm repeatedly contemplated legal action on grounds of high treason, and a preliminary inquiry was instigated to this end by the Reich Office of Justice. And due to Bismarck's reputation and him being seen as a demigod that forged the German Empire, he was virtually untouchable despite all the efforts by Wilhelm and his ministers in rebuking a lot of these claims. And the fact that, to this day, the commonly held beliefs that Wilhelm was mentally unstable and that Bismarck resigned over foreign policy disagreements do actually demonstrate that he was successful in the end and really got the last laugh. So, considering everything I have talked about, I believe the fair conclusion we could make is that the dismissal of Bismarck by Wilhelm II was perfectly understandable, and perhaps Wilhelm had done him a favor and let him live out the rest of his years in peace. While perhaps you could still make some arguments as to why dismissing him may have been a mistake, I think that at this point the common caricatures of Wilhelm dismissing the Iron Chancellor over petty reasons, his own ego, irrationality, are just completely untrue. From Wilhelm's point of view, there was a strong case to be made that it was time for Bismarck to retire, considering the deterioration of his mental condition and the stunts he pulled in regards to the social question. And this was also not an entirely unpopular decision in Germany at that time. Plenty of people, and even the millions of workers, definitely let out a sigh of relief. A prominent critic of Wilhelm from that time, Paul Busching, had to give credit to the Kaiser in this regard in 1908. Is it a coincidence that the impression of Wilhelm II's first decisive act, the dismissal of Bismarck, has been entirely blurred over the decades? Let us recall that on March 28, 1890, the Kaiser did not stand alone. There were millions who wanted to mark the resignation of the first chancellor as the beginning of a new era of healthy, free development. These people were alienated by Bismarck's administrative methods, his economic policies, and his views on the workers' question and socialism. Now, I know that throughout this video I have been, well, pretty harsh on Bismarck, but despite all this, I do not hate him, far from it. I still admire him and his works. He was, after all, the man who forged Germany in iron and blood. If it wasn't for him, the German Empire as we know it may not have existed, or would have looked very different. But even if we hold him in such a high regard, we must not forget or make the mistake of seeing him as infallible. By the 1880s, the man who once masterfully wielded iron and blood to forge an empire had begun to show signs of decline. Age and the toll of decades of unrelenting political dominance had transformed him into a figure increasingly driven by paranoia and irrationality. He just was not the same person from the years we remember him in history for. Yet, it should also really be said that these final years should not overshadow his earlier brilliance. To judge Bismarck solely by his later actions would be to ignore the profound impact he had on shaping modern Germany and indeed Europe itself. His achievements were monumental, and his vision of a unified German state remains a testament to his political genius. He was, after all, a human being, prone to the same frailties and limitations as anyone else. That he faltered in his final years and could not live up to the shadow and image he once established for himself long ago does not diminish the heroic stature of his life's work. In the end, his resignation in 1890 was not merely the result of personal conflict with Kaiser Wilhelm II, but perhaps a necessary transition. The political landscape had evolved, and so too did the needs of the German state. It was undeniably time for Bismarck to step aside, allowing a new chapter to begin, and letting a younger and perhaps even more ambitious captain to take the steering wheel. So, let us honor him, not for his imperfections, but for the enduring mark he left on history. His name deserves admiration, his story respect, and his humanity understanding. Ironically, this is the exact same thing that Kaiser himself advocated in his own later years while writing his memoirs. I know I am technically breaking my rule from the start, but since I have made all of my points and arguments, I feel that it is fitting to end this video with one final quote from the man he had always clashed with. Prince Bismarck's greatness as a statesman and his imperishable services to Prussia and Germany are historical facts of such tremendous significance that there is doubtless no man in existence, whatever his party affiliations, who would dare to place them in question. For this very reason alone, it is stupid to accuse me of not having recognized the greatness of Prince Bismarck. The opposite is the truth. I revered and idolized him, nor could it be otherwise. It should be borne in mind with what generation I grew up, the generation of the devotees of Bismarck. He was the creator of the German Empire, the paladin of my grandfather, and all of us considered him the greatest statesman of his day and were proud that he was a German. Bismarck was the idol in my temple, whom I worshipped. But monarchs are also human beings of flesh and blood. Hence, they too are exposed to the influences emanating from the conduct of others. Therefore, looking at the matters from a human point of view, one will understand how Prince Bismarck, by his fight against me, himself destroyed, with heavy blows, the idol of which I have spoken. But my reverence for Bismarck, the great statesman, remained unaltered.